When we speak of reality, we often assume it to be something fixed, external, measurable, and independent of our perception. But once you understand this reality shift, a startling truth begins to emerge. Reality, as we experience it, is never truly objective. It is deeply symbolic. Every perception is filtered through a lens we did not design, a psychic structure shaped by memory, culture, instinct, and the unseen architecture of the unconscious. What we believe to be out there is, to a profound degree, a reflection of what is in here. The psyche doesn't passively record reality like a camera. It organizes and interprets experience according to patterns, what might be called archetypes, universal forms that structure not only our myths and dreams, but the very way we see the world. These inner patterns don't just color our thoughts. They select and shape what we even notice. A person living in fear will not perceive the same world as one living in hope. The stimuli may be identical, but the inner narrative that receives them alters everything. The outer world bends subtly but surely to fit the inner world's frame. Most of us never realize this because the symbolic nature of our experience operates unconsciously. We are embedded in our own projections, mistaking them for facts. We encounter authority and see our father. We face chaos and feel the echo of ancient mythic dragons. A failure at work is not just a setback. It becomes a reflection of our inadequacy, our worthlessness, our unseen wound. These associations are not rational. They are psychic. They rise from the deeper layers of the self and cloak our reality with meaning, often without our consent or awareness. But to understand this, to really grasp it, is to awaken. Once we stop insisting that our perceptions are purely rational or factual and begin to explore their symbolic nature, we become participants in our own reality rather than passive recipients. This is not about denying objective facts, but about recognizing that facts alone never tell the full story. How we interpret them, what we fear in them, what we hope they mean, these interpretations arise from within, shaped by personal and collective unconscious forces. You see, the mind does not seek truth in the abstract, it seeks meaning, and meaning is never neutral. A symbol, unlike a sign, cannot be reduced to a single interpretation. It lives, it shifts, it invites us into dialogue with our deeper selves. When you understand that what appears to be mundane reality is laced with personal significance, it changes how you live. Every conflict becomes an encounter with the shadow. Every synchronicity becomes a call to awaken. Every pattern that repeats in your life, especially the painful ones, becomes a doorway to understanding something you have yet to integrate. This shift is subtle, but it is radical. It means that your suffering is not random, your joy is not trivial. And the people who trigger you the most are not just problematic. They are mirrors, reflecting some aspect of yourself you've exiled or forgotten. When reality becomes symbolic, life becomes participatory. It is no longer something happening to you, it is something happening through you, and, if you're paying attention, something happening for you. So the question is no longer just what is happening in my life, but what is this trying to show me about myself? That shift from external control to inner inquiry is the beginning of transformation. Because once you understand this reality shift, you can never again look at life as merely circumstantial. You begin to see the world not as it is, but as you are. And that is where your power begins. If the symbolic nature of reality reveals that much of what we encounter is a reflection of our inner world, then the next logical step, though often the most uncomfortable, is to look within. The real shift, the transformative pivot that begins to alter how we move through the world, does not come from changing external conditions. It begins the moment we stop trying to manipulate the outer world and instead turn inward to meet ourselves. That turning inward is not mere introspection. It is confrontation. It is dialogue with the parts of ourselves we have refused to know. Most people avoid this. They say they want change, but what they really want is relief. They seek progress without pain, growth without sacrifice. But the psyche doesn't evolve that way. It cannot be tricked. It demands honesty. The unconscious does not respond to declarations or intentions. It responds to integration. And integration begins with recognition. This is why the real work, the only work that leads to lasting transformation, starts with seeing the truth of who we are. Not the curated self, not the social mask we present, not the image we polished for others to accept, but the unedited, often chaotic, multi-layered self that lives beneath. the one that carries both our light and our shadow, the one we instinctively protect from exposure, even from ourselves. To face that self is not easy. It's not meant to be, because it involves dismantling illusions we've built for decades, sometimes generations. We must examine the stories we inherited, the identities we cling to, the defense mechanisms that once kept us safe but now keep us stuck. These patterns are not just habits, they are psychic structures that have taken root in the unconscious. They influence how we relate, how we love, how we suffer, and unless we bring them to light, they will continue to operate in silence, directing our lives from behind the curtain. The moment of inner recognition, the true beginning of the reality shift, is rarely dramatic. Often it begins quietly in a moment of disillusionment or despair. Something fails, a relationship ends, a career path crumbles, and suddenly the old narrative no longer holds. We realize we cannot keep doing things the same way. That rupture is sacred. It is the opening, and if we have the courage to stay with it, to not run from the discomfort, it becomes the doorway into deeper awareness. But let us be clear, self-awareness is not the end goal. Awareness without integration is just exposure. True transformation only occurs when we take what we have found in the dark and bring it into the light of conscious choice. When we no longer disown our envy, our fear, our longing, but instead ask what they are trying to teach us. When we stop projecting blame onto others and recognize the wound within ourselves that drew them into our lives in the first place. This is not a one-time realization. It is a process, a disciplined, compassionate, and often painful unfolding. But every step toward greater inner recognition loosens the grip of unconscious patterns. Every insight brings us closer to inner authority, the kind that cannot be taken from us because it was never given by anyone else. It is ours because we earned it through encounter, through truth, through the willingness to face what is real. So if you're searching for the beginning of the shift, it is here. Not in changing your job, not in finding the right partner, not in chasing new experiences. The shift begins the moment you turn inward and ask, not at what is wrong with the world, but at what in me has yet to be seen. That is the question that changes everything. As we begin to recognize that reality is symbolic and that transformation starts with inner recognition, we inevitably come to a threshold. The boundary between who we believe we are and the deeper self waiting beneath that construct. And here, something profound and unsettling occurs. The ego resists. The part of us that has clung to old identities, familiar roles, and predictable narratives senses that it is no longer in control. This is the stage where the true shift demands its price, the symbolic death of the ego. Now, let me be clear. The ego is not evil. It is necessary. It gives structure to our consciousness, helps us function in the world, and forms the sense of I that navigates daily life. But the ego, by its very nature, fears dissolution. It resists anything that threatens its definition of reality, even if that reality is limiting or false. And so when faced with the deeper truths of the self, the totality of the psyche, the ego clings tighter. It defends, it rationalizes, it denies. This is why transformation is so often preceded by a crisis. Something must break. The structure that once held you must collapse. The persona you wore must no longer fit. The illusion must fracture. And in that space, confusing, painful, often terrifying, a kind of death occurs. Not physical, of course, but psychological, a stripping away, the loss of certainty, the falling away of who you thought you were. In mythology, this is the descent into the underworld, the dark night of the soul, the confrontation with the abyss. Every authentic transformation follows this arc. The hero is cast out of the known world, loses their bearings, and meets what they fear most. But what myths tell us, and what psychology confirms, is that this death is not the end. It is the necessary precondition for rebirth. You cannot be reborn as your deeper self until the false self has died. The persona, the mask, must be surrendered. The ego must loosen its grip, not because it has failed, but because it has done its job and must now step aside. In its place, something larger, wiser, and more whole begins to emerge. This is the self, not the ego's fantasy of perfection, but the integration of opposites. Light and shadow, conscious and unconscious, personal and universal. To go through this process willingly requires enormous courage. It means walking into the unknown without guarantees. It means facing the parts of yourself you were taught to reject. It means embracing uncertainty not as a threat, but as a portal. Most people avoid it. They retreat back into old habits, find new distractions, or blame others for their discontent. But those who stay, who remain present in the dissolution, discover something remarkable. They are not who they thought they were, but they are far more than they ever imagined. There is a profound liberation in this. Because once you no longer need to defend the ego's fragile identity, you become free. Free to live from your center, free to act with authenticity, free to engage the world not as a battlefield, but as a mirror of your own unfolding consciousness. This is not a one-time event. The death and rebirth cycle repeats many times over a lifetime, each time peeling away another layer of illusion, each time bringing you closer to your core. But the first death, the first true letting go, is the most important. Because once you pass through it, you understand something essential. The self you feared losing was never your true self at all. And that realization, that clarity born of surrender, is what marks the beginning of real freedom. When the old identity begins to dissolve and the ego loosens its grip, we often find ourselves in a kind of inner wilderness. The structures that once gave meaning and order have fallen away. We can no longer rely on the familiar stories, and yet the new story has not yet taken form. This in-between space, the liminal realm, is not a mistake. It is a vital part of the transformation, but it is also where many turn back. Because in this place of uncertainty, the mind demands clarity, the ego demands control, and neither are immediately available. Yet something deeper is at work here if we know how to look. In these periods of uncertainty, what many experience is confusion, anxiety, or existential fatigue. The unconscious begins to speak in its native language, symbol. And if we are to move through this terrain with any sense of direction, it is the symbol, not logic, that becomes our guide. Symbols are not arbitrary images. They are not inventions of the conscious mind. They are living expressions of something deeper, something primordial. A symbol condenses meaning. It bridges the seen and the unseen, the conscious and the unconscious. It doesn't explain, it reveals. And in times of psychological upheaval, these symbolic messages are not just important. They are essential because they show us what words cannot. Dreams are perhaps the most direct way the unconscious offers its symbols. In times of inner change, dreams often become more vivid, more urgent. Not because the unconscious is disturbed, but because it is trying to guide. A dream of drowning might not mean literal danger, but could point to being overwhelmed by repressed emotion. A recurring image of a house with locked doors might be a sign that there are parts of the psyche still inaccessible, still waiting to be opened. These are not puzzles to solve, but invitations to listen. And then there are synchronicities, those strange and meaningful coincidences that seem to defy rational explanation. A book falls off a shelf with a message that speaks directly to your current struggle. A stranger says something in passing that answers a question you hadn't spoken aloud. In the old world, these would be dismissed as chance, but once the reality shift has begun, you start to see them differently, not as random, but as reflections of an inner process mirrored by the outer world. The psyche, after all, is not separate from reality. It participates in it. We live in a culture that worships certainty and dismisses the symbolic as irrational or unscientific. But psychological truth does not operate on the level of scientific proof. It operates on the level of meaning. A symbol does not prove, it transforms. And to follow a symbol is not to abandon reason, but to acknowledge that reason alone is not enough. This is not a call to magical thinking. It is a call to deeper attention. Symbols do not demand belief. They demand engagement, and in engaging with them through dreams, through art, through myth, through the patterns of our own lives, we begin to dialogue with the unconscious in a way that brings guidance where before there was only confusion. The symbolic is the soul's compass. It does not give you a map, but it gives you a direction, and that is all you need when navigating the unknown. The map will come later, when the meaning has crystallized, when the new self has taken form. But during the shift, while the old is dying and the new is gestating, the symbol is what keeps you oriented. It reminds you that even in chaos there is pattern, even in silence there is voice. So pay attention, not to what makes the most sense, but to what stirs the deepest. That stirring is the sign. That is the signal that something in you is awakening. If you've followed the path this far through the recognition of reality as symbolic, through the confrontation with the unconscious, the death of the old self, and the navigation of chaos by way of symbol, you may begin to feel a subtle but powerful shift in your orientation to life. The question now becomes, what is the goal of all this inner work? Is it perfection, enlightenment, liberation from suffering? These are alluring ideals, but they risk becoming distractions. The true aim, if we are honest, is not perfection, it is wholeness. Wholeness means embracing the totality of who you are, not just the polished or socially acceptable parts. It means integrating what was once split off or disowned, the shadow, the wounded child, the repressed instincts, even the things you once judged as flaws or weakness. To become whole is not to become flawless, it is to become real. It is to hold together the opposites within you, hope and fear, rage and tenderness, strength and vulnerability, without identifying completely with any one of them. This is what makes the reality shift so radical. It dismantles the lie of the divided self. The old paradigm tells us we must eliminate our darkness to be good, silence our emotions to be strong, and present a mask of competence to be worthy. But the psyche does not thrive under denial, it thrives under integration. The energy we spend repressing and fragmenting ourselves drains our vitality. But when we allow these parts to speak, to take their place in the inner system, we recover a kind of psychic integrity that no external success can substitute. Integration is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong dialogue, and it is often messy. You will fall back into old patterns. You will project. You will forget. But each time you return to yourself with honesty, each time you choose to listen rather than suppress, to inquire rather than judge, something in you deepens. You become less reactive, more attuned. Life becomes less about controlling outcomes and more about participating consciously in the unfolding of your own being. And it's important to remember, the shift doesn't make life easier. In fact, in some ways it makes you feel more. More pain, yes, but also more meaning. More conflict, perhaps, but also more alignment. You become less buffered from the suffering of the world, but more capable of holding it. And through that capacity, you contribute something essential, not through perfection, but through presence. Wholeness changes the way you relate, not just to yourself, but to others. You no longer need to manipulate or dominate, because you're no longer at war within. You can hold space for difference, because you've come to terms with the contradictions in your own nature. You no longer seek in others what you've failed to find in yourself. You don't need them to carry your shadow or inflate your ego. You can meet them as they are, because you've done the work to meet yourself as you are. This is what makes the reality shift so liberating. It moves you from fragmentation to coherence, from compulsion to choice. It doesn't promise a pain-free existence, but it does offer something far more valuable: authenticity, depth, and a way of being that is aligned with the full spectrum of your humanity. So if you're waiting for a sign that the work is worth it, this is it. Not a perfect life, but a conscious one. Not an escape from reality, but a deeper participation in it. Because once you've experienced this shift, you can never again pretend you are merely a product of your circumstances. You know now that you are a participant in your becoming, and that knowledge, earned, embodied, and lived, is the beginning of true inner authority.